Chapter 16 of Septimus by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 16. In the course of time, Cypher returned to London to fight a losing battle against the powers of darkness, and derive whatever inspiration he could from Zora's letters. He also called dutifully at the Nook during his weekend visits to Penton Court, where he found restfulness in the atmosphere of lavender. Mrs. Oldreeve continued to regard him as a most superior person. Cousin Jane, as became a gentlewoman of breeding, received him with courtesy, but a courtesy marked by that shade of reserve which is due from a lady of quality to the grandfatherless. If she had not striven against the unregeneracy of mortal flesh, she would have disapproved of him off-hand, because she disapproved of Zora. But she was a conscientious woman, and took great pride in overcoming prejudices. She also collected pewter, the history of which Cypher, during his years of self-education, had once studied, in the confused notion that it was culture. All knowledge is good, from the theory of quaternions to the way to cut a ham-frill. It is sure to come in useful somehow. An authority on Central African dialects has been known to find them invaluable in altercations with cabmen, and a converted burglar has, before now, become an admirable house-agent. What Cypher therefore had considered merely learned lumber in his head cemented his friendship with Cousin Jane, or, rather to speak by the book, soldered it with pewter. As for the cure, however, she did not believe in it, and told him so roundly. She had been brought up to believe in doctors, the Catechism, the House of Lords, the inequality of the sexes, and the Oldreeve family, and in that faith she would live and die. Cypher bore her no malice. She did not call the cure pestilential quackery. He was beginning not to despise the day of small things. "It may be very good in its way," she said, "just as liberalism and Darwinism and eating in restaurants may be good things, but they are not for me." Cousin Jane's conversation provided him with much innocent entertainment. Mrs. Oldreeve was content to talk about the weather, and what Zora and Emmy used to like to eat when they were little girls. Subjects interesting in themselves, but not conducive to discussion. Cousin Jane was nothing if not argumentative. She held views, expounded them, and maintained them. Nothing short of a declaration from Jehovah bursting in glory through the sky could have convinced her of error. Even then she would have been annoyed. She profoundly disapproved of Emmy's marriage to Septimus, whom she characterized as a doddering idiot. Cypher defended his friend warmly. He also defended Wiggleswick, at whose ways and habits the good lady expressed unrestrained indignation. She could not have spoken more disrespectfully of Antichrist. "You mark my words," she said, "he'll murder them both in their sleep." Concerning Zora, too, she was emphatic. "I am not one of those who think every woman ought to get married, but if she can't conduct herself decently without a husband, she ought to have one." "But surely Mrs. Middlemis's conduct is irreproachable," said Cypher. "Irreproachable? Do you think trapezing about all over the earth, mixing with all sorts of people she doesn't know from Adam, and going goodness knows where, and doing goodness knows what, and idling her wife away, never putting a darn in her stockings even, is irreproachable conduct on the part of a young woman of Zora's birth and appearance? The way she dresses must attract attention wherever she goes. It's supposed to be stylish nowadays. In my time it was immodest. When a young woman was forced to journey alone, she made herself as inconspicuous as possible. Zora ought to have a husband to look after her. Then she could do as she liked, or as he liked, which would be much the best thing for her." "I happen to be in Mrs. Middlemis's confidence," said Cypher. "She has told me many times that she would never marry again. Her marriage—" "Stuff and rubbish!" cried Cousin Jane. "You wait until the man comes along who has made up his mind to marry her. It must be a big, strong man who won't stand any nonsense and will take her by the shoulders and shake her. She'll marry him fast enough. We'll see what happens to her in California." "I hope she won't marry one of those dreadful creatures with lassos," said Mrs. Oldreeve, whose hazy ideas of California were based on hazier memories of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which he had seen many years ago in London. "I hope Mrs. Middlemis won't marry at all," said Cypher, in a tone of alarm. "Why?" asked Cousin Jane. She shot the question at him with almost a snarl. Cypher paused for a moment or two before replying. "I should lose a friend," said he. "Huh!" said Cousin Jane. If the late Reverend Lawrence Sterne had known Cousin Jane, Tristram Shandy would have been the richer by a chapter on humphs. He would have analysed this particular one with a minute delicacy beyond the powers of Clem Cypher, through whose head rang the echo of the irritating vocable for some time afterwards. It meant something. It meant something uncomfortable. It was directly levelled at himself, and yet it seemed to sum up her previous disparaging remarks about Zora. What the dickens did she mean by it? He asked himself. He came down to Nunsmere every week now, having given up his establishment at Kilburn Priory and sold the house, the Kerr House, as he had named it in his pride. A set of bachelor's chambers in St. James's sheltered him during his working days in London. He had also sold his motor car, for retrenchment in personal expenses had become necessary, and the purchase money of house and car were needed for the war of advertising which he was waging against his rivals. These were days black with anxiety and haunting doubt, illuminated now and then by Zora, who wrote gracious letters of encouragement. He carried them about with him like talismans. Sometimes he could not realize that the great business he had created could be on the brink of failure. The routine went on as usual. At the works at Bermondsey the same activity apparently prevailed as when the cure had reached the heyday of its fortune some 5 years before. In the sweet-smelling laboratory, gleaming with white tiles and copper retorts, the white-aproned workmen sorted and weighed and treated, according to the secret recipe, the bundles of herbs that came in every day and were stacked in pigeon-holes along the walls. In the boiling sheds, not so sweet-smelling, the great vats of fat bubbled and ran, giving out to the cooling troughs the refined white cream of which the precious ointment was made. Beyond there was another laboratory, vast and clean and busy, where the healing ichor of the herbs was mixed with the drugs and the cream. Then came the workrooms, where rows of girls filled the celluloid boxes, one dabbing in the well-judged quantity, another cutting it off clean to the level of the top with a swift stroke of the spatula, another fitting on the lid, and so on, in endless but fascinating monotony, until the last girl placed on the trolley by her side, waiting to carry it to the packing shed, the finished packet of Cypher's cure as it would be delivered to the world. Then there were the packing sheds full of deal cases for dispatching the cure to the 4 quarters of the globe, some empty, some being filled, others stacked in readiness for the carriers. A babel of sounds, of hammering clamps, of creaking barrows, of horses by the open doors rattling their heavy harness and trampling the flagstones with their heavy hoofs. A ceaseless rushing of brawny men in sackcloth aprons, of dusty men with stumps of pencils and notebooks and crumpled invoices, counting and checking and reporting to other men in narrow glass offices against the wall. Outside stood the great wagons laden with the white deal boxes bound with iron hoops and bearing in vermilion letters the inscription of Cypher's cure. Every detail of this complicated hive was as familiar to him as his kitchen was to his cook. He had planned it all, organized it all. Every action of every human creature in the place, from the skilled pharmaceutist responsible for the preparation of the ointment to the grimy boy who did odd jobs about the sheds, had been preconceived by him and had its mainspring in his brain. Apart from idealistic aspirations concerning with the cure itself, the perfecting of this machinery of human activity had been a matter of absorbing interest, its perfection a subject of honourable pride. He walked through the works day after day, noting the familiar sights and sounds, pausing here and there lovingly, as a man does in his garden to touch some cherished plant or to fill himself with the beauty of some rare flower. The place was inexpressibly dear to him. That those furnaces should ever grow cold, that those vats should ever be empty, that those 2 magic words should cease to blaze on the wooden boxes, should fade from the sight of man, that those gates should ever be shut, seemed to transcend imagination. The factory had taken its rank with eternal, unchanging things, like the solar system and the Bank of England. Yet he knew only too well that there had been change in the unchanging, and in his soul dwelt a sickening certainty that the eternal would be transient. Gradually the staff had been reduced, the output lessened. Already 2 of the long tables once filled with girls stood forlornly empty. His comfortably appointed office in Moorgate Street told the same story. Week after week the orders slackened, and gradually the number of clerks had shrunk. Gloom settled permanently on the manager's brow. He almost walked on tiptoe into Cypher's room and spoke to him in a hushed whisper, until rebuked for dismalness. "If you look like that, Shuttleworth, I shall cry." On another occasion Shuttleworth said, "We are throwing money away on advertisements. The concern can't stand it." Cypher turned, blue pencil in hand, from the wall where draft proofs of advertisements were pinned for his correction and master's touch. This was a part of the business he loved. It appealed to the flamboyant in his nature. It particularly pleased him to see omnibuses pass by bearing the famous Cypher's Cure, an enlargement of his own handwriting, in streaming letters of blood. "We're going to double them," said he, and his air was that of the racing Mississippi captains of old days, who, in response to the expostulation of their engineers, sent a little nigger boy to sit on the safety valve. The dismal manager turned up his eyes to heaven with the air of the family steward in Hogarth's Marriage à la Mode. He had not his chief's Napoleonic mind, but he had a wife and a large family. Clem Cypher also thought of that, not only of Shuttleworth's wife and family, but also of the wives and families of the many men in his employ. It kept him awake at nights. In the soothing air of Dunsmuir, however, he slept in long, dead stretches, as a tired man sleeps in spite of trains which screech past the bottom of his lawn. Their furious unrest enhanced the peace of village things. He began to love the little backwater of the earth, whose stillness calmed the fever of life. As soon as he stepped out onto the platform at Ripstead, a cool hand seemed to touch his forehead and charm away the cares that made his temples throb. At Dunsmuir he gave himself up to the simplicities of the place. He took to strolling, like Septimus, about the common and made friends with the lame donkey. On Sunday mornings he went to church. He had first found himself there out of curiosity, for, though not an irreligious man, he was not given to pious practices. But afterwards he had gone on account of the restfulness of the rural service. His mind, essentially reverent, took it very seriously, just as it took seriously the works of a great poet which he could not understand, or any alien form of human aspiration. Even the parish notices and the publication of banns he received with earnest attention. His intensity of interest as he listened to the sermon sometimes flattered the mild vicar, and at other times, when thinness of argument pricked his conscience, alarmed him considerably. But Cypher would not have dared enter into theological disputation. He took the sermon as he took the hymns, in which he joined lustily. Cousin Jane, whom he invariably met with Mrs. Oldreeve after the service and escorted home, had no such scruples. She tore the vicar's theology into fragments and scattered them behind her as she walked, like a hare in a paper chase. Said the literary man from London, who had strolled with them on one of these occasions, "The good lady is one of those women who speak as if they had a relation who had married a high official in the kingdom of heaven, and now and then gave them confidential information." Cypher liked Rattendon because he could often put into a phrase his own unformulated ideas. He also belonged to a world in which he himself was a stranger, the world of books and plays and personalities and theories of art. Cypher thought that its denizens lived on a lofty plane. "The atmosphere," said Rattendon, "is so rarefied that the kettle refuses to boil properly. That is why we always have cold tea at literary gatherings. My dear fellow, it's a damned world. It takes all day and does nothing all night. The ragged Italian in front of the fresco in his village church, or at the back of the gallery of the opera of his town, knows more essentials of painting and music than any of us. It's a hollow sham of a world filled with empty words. I love it." "Then why abuse it?" laughed Cypher. "Because it's a wanton, and the wanton angers you and fascinates you at the same time. You never know how to take her. You're aware she hasn't got a heart, but her lips are red. She's unreal. She holds views in defiance of common sense. Which is the nobler thing to do, to dig potatoes, or paint a man digging potatoes? She swears to you that the digger is a clod of earth and the painter a handful of heaven. She's talking rot. You know it. And yet you believe her." Cypher was not convinced by the airy paradoxion. He had a childish idea that painters and novelists and actors were superior beings. Ratterton found this Arcadian and cultivated Cypher's society. They took long walks together on Sunday afternoons. "After all," said Ratterton, "I can speak freely. I am a pariah among my kind." Cypher asked why. "Because I don't play golf. In London it is impossible to be seriously regarded as a literary man unless you play golf." He found Cypher a good listener. He loved to catch a theory of life, hold it in his hand like a struggling bird while he discoursed about it, and let it go free into the sunshine again. Cypher admired his nimbleness of mind. "You juggle with ideas as the fellows on the stage do with gilt balls." "It's a game I learned," said Ratterton. "It's very useful. Takes one's mind off the dull question of earning bread and butter for a wife and 5 children. "I wish you'd teach it to me," said Cypher. "I've many wives and many children dependent on me for bread and butter." Ratterton was quick to note the tone of depression. He laughed kindly. "Looking on is just as good. When you're worried in London, why don't you look me up? My wife and I will play the game for you. She's an amusing body. Heaven knows now how I should have got through without her. She also swears by Cypher's cure." So they became friends. Cypher, since the blistered heel episode, had lost his fearless way of trumpeting the cure far and wide, having a nervous dread of seeing the P and Q of the hateful words form themselves on the lips of a companion. He became subdued, and spoke only of travel and men and things, of anything but the cure. He preferred to listen, and as Ratterton preferred to talk, he found conversation a simple matter. Ratterton was an amusing anecdotist and had amassed a prodigious amount of raw material for his craft. To the collector, by some unknown law of attraction, come the objects which he collects. Everywhere he goes he finds them to his hand, as Septimus' friend found the Toby-jugs. Wherever Ratterton turned, a bit of gossip met his ear. Very few things therefore happened in literary and theatrical London which did not come inevitably to his knowledge. He could have wrecked many homes and pricked many reputations. As a man of the world, however, he used his knowledge with discretion, and as an artist in anecdote he selected fastidiously. He seldom retailed a bit of gossip for its own sake. When he did so, he had a purpose. One evening they dined together at Cypher's Club, a great semi-political institution with many thousand members. He had secured, however, a quiet table in a corner of the dining-room, which was adorned with full-length portraits of self-conscious statesmen. Cypher unfolded his napkin with an air of satisfaction. "I've had good news to-day. Mrs. Middlemist is on her way home." "You have the privilege of her friendship," said Ratterton. "You ought to be envied. O fortunate nimium." He preserved some of the Oxford tradition in tone and manner. He had brown hair turning grey, a drooping moustache, and more pince-nez secured by a broad black cord. Being very short-sighted, his eyes, seen through the thick lenses, were almost expressionless. "Zora Middlemist," said he, squeezing lemon over his oysters, "is a grand and splendid creature whom I admire vastly. As I never lose an opportunity of telling her that she is doing nothing with her grand and splendid qualities, I suffer under the ban of her displeasure." "What do you think she ought to do with them?" asked Cypher. "It's a difficult and delicate matter to discuss a woman with another man, especially—" He waved a significant hand. "But I, in my little way, have written a novel or two, studies of women. I speak, therefore, as an expert. Now, just as a painter can't correctly draw the draped figure unless he has an anatomical knowledge of the limbs beneath, so is a novelist unable to present the character of a woman with sincerity and verisimilitude unless he has taken into account all the hidden physiological workings of the woman's nature. He must be familiar with the workings of the sex principle within her, although he did not need to show them in his work, any more than the painter shows the anatomy. Analysing thus the imaginary woman, one forms a habit of analysing the real woman in whom one takes an interest, or rather one does it unconsciously." He paused. "I told you it was rather delicate. You see what I'm trying to get at? Laura Middlemist is driven round the earth like Io by the gadfly of her temperament. She's seeking the beauty or meaning or fulfillment or whatever she chooses to call it of life. What she's really looking for is love." "I don't believe it," said Cypher. Rattlesnake shrugged his shoulders. "It's true all the same. But in her case it's the great love, the big thing for the big man, the gorgeous tropical sunshine in which all the splendour of her can develop. No little man will move her. She draws them all round her. That type has an irresistible atmosphere, but she passes them by with her magnificent head in the air. She's looking all the time for the big man. The pathetic comedy of it is that she is as innocent and as unconscious of the object of her search as the flower that opens its heart to the bee bearing the pollen on its wings. I'm not infallible as a general rule. In this case I am." He hastened to consume his soup, which had got cold during his harangue. "You've mixed much with women and studied them," said Cypher. "I haven't. I was engaged to a girl once, but it was a tepid affair. She broke it off because it was much more vital to me to work in my laboratory than to hold her hand in her mother's parlour. No doubt she was right. This was in the early days when I was experimenting with the cure. Since then I've been a man of one idea. It has absorbed all my soul and energies, so that I've had none to spare for women. Here and there, of course. I know, the trifling things, they are part of the banquet of life. One eats and forgets." Cypher glanced at him and nodded his appreciation of the literary man's neat way of putting things. But he did not reply. He ate his fish in silence, hardly tasting it, his mind far away following Zora Middlemist across the seas. A horrible, jealous hatred of the big man for whom she sought sprang up in his heart. His pink face flushed red. "This sole bonne femme is excellent," said Rattlesnake. Cypher started in confusion and praised the chef and talked gastronomy, while his thoughts were with Zora. He remembered the confession of Septimus Dix in Paris. Septimus had been caught in the irresistible atmosphere. He loved her, but he was one of the little men, and she had passed him by with her magnificent head in the air. The gastronomic talk languished. Presently Rattlesnake said, "One of the feminine phenomena that has puzzled me most of late has been the marriage of her sister to Septimus Dix." Cypher laid down his knife and fork. "How extraordinary that you should mention it. He was in my mind as you spoke." "I was thinking of the sister," said Rattlesnake. "She has Mrs. Middlemist's temperament without her force of character, the sex without the splendour. I heard a very curious thing about her only yesterday." "What was it?" "It was one of those things that are not told." "Tell me," said Cypher earnestly. "I have reasons for asking. I am convinced that there are circumstances of which neither Mrs. Dix's mother nor sister know anything. I'm a loyal man. You may trust me." "Very well," said Rattlesnake. "Have you ever heard of a man called Mordaunt Prince? Yes, a well-known actor, about the biggest blackguard that disgraces the stage. He was leading man at the theatre where she last played. They were doing The Widow of Weir. They were about a great deal together. It was common gossip at the time." "Gossip is notoriously uncharitable," said Cypher. "If charity covers a multitude of sins, uncharitableness has the advantage of uncovering them. The Pudor Britannicus, however, is responsible for uncovering the one I am going to tell you of. About 2 or 3 months before the marriage, Amy Aldreeve and Mordaunt Prince were staying together at an hotel in Tunbridge Wells. There was no mistake about it. There they were. They had a motor with them. A week before the Dix marriage was announced, Mordaunt Prince married a Mrs. Morris, old Sol Morris, the moneylender's widow." Cypher stared at him. "It's one of the least amazing of human phenomena," said Rattlesnake cynically. "I'm only puzzled at Calypso being so soon able to console herself for the departure of Ulysses and taking up with such a dreamy-headed shadow of a man as our friend Dix. The end of the Mordaunt Prince story is that he soon grew too much for the widow, who has pensioned him off, and now he is drinking himself to death in Naples." "Amy Aldreeve! Good God, is it possible?" cried Cypher, absently pushing aside the dish the waiter handed him. Rattlesnake carefully helped himself to partridge and orange salad. "It's not only possible, but unquestionable fact. You see," he added complacently. "Nothing can happen without its coming sooner or later to me. My informant was staying at the hotel all the time. You will allow me to vouch absolutely for her veracity." Cypher did not speak for some moments. The large dining-room with its portrait of self-conscious statesman faded away and became a little street in Paris, one side in shade and the other baking in the sun. And at a little iron table sat a brown and indiscreet Zouave and Septimus Dix, pale, indecisive, with a wistful appeal in his washed-out blue eyes. Suddenly he regained consciousness, and more for the sake of covering his loss of self-possession than for that of eating, he recalled the waiter and put some partridge on his plate. Then he looked across the table at his guest and said very sternly, "I look to you to prevent this story going any further." "I've already made it my duty to do so," said Rattendon. Cypher helped his guest to wine. "I hope you like this Roederer," said he. "It's the only exquisite wine in the club, and unfortunately there are not more than a few bottles left. I had 7 dozen of the same cuvée in my cellar at Priory Park, if anything in better condition. I had to sell it with the rest of the things when I gave up the house. It went to my heart. Champagne is the only wine I understand. There was a time when it stood as a symbol to me of the unattainable. Now that I can drink it when I will, I know that all the laws of philosophy forbid its having any attraction for me. Thank heavens, I'm not dyspeptic enough in soul to be a philosopher, and I'm grateful for my aspirations. I cultivated my taste for champagne out of sheer gratitude." "Any wise man," said Rattendon, "can realize his dreams. It takes something much higher than wisdom to enjoy the realization." "What is that?" "The heart of a child," said Rattendon. He smiled in his inscrutable way behind his thick lenses, and sipped his champagne. "Truly a delicious wine," said he. Cypher said good-bye to his guest on the steps of the club, and walked home to his new chambers in St. James's, deep in thought. For the first time since his acquaintance with Rattendon, he was glad to part from him. He had a great need of solitude. It came to him almost as a shock to realize that things were happening in the world round about him quite as heroic in the eyes of the high gods as the battle between Cypher's cure and Jebusa Jones's cuticle remedy. The curtain of life had been lifted, and a flash of its inner mysteries had been revealed. His eyes still were dazed. But he had received the gift of vision. He had seen beyond doubt or question the heart of Septimus Dix. He knew what he had done, why he had done it. Zora Middlemister passed Septimus by with her magnificent head in the air. But he was not one of the little men. "By God, he is not!" he cried aloud, and the cry came from his depths. Zora Middlemister passed him, Clem Cypher, by with her magnificent head in the air. He let himself into his chambers. They struck him as being chill and lonely, the casual, uncared-for hiding-place of one of the little men. He stirred the fire, almost afraid to disturb the cold silence by the rattle of the poker against the bars of the grate. His slippers were set in readiness on the hearth-rug, and the machine who valeted him had fitted him with boot-trees. He put them on, and, unlocking his desk, took out the letter which he had received that morning from Zora. "For you," she wrote, "I want victory all along the line, the apotheosis of Cypher's cure on earth. For myself, I don't know what I want. I wish you would tell me." Clem Cypher sat in an armchair and looked into the fire until it went out. For the first time in his life, he did not know what he wanted. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Septimus by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 17. The days that followed were darkened by overwhelming anxieties, so that he speculated little as to the ultimately desired. A chartered accountant sat in the office at Moorgate Street and shed around him the gloom of statistics. Unless a miracle happened, the cure was doomed. It is all very well to seat a little nigger on the safety valve if the end of the journey is in sight. The boiler may just last out the strain. But to suppose that he will sit there in permanent security to himself and the ship for an indefinite time is an optimism unwarranted by the general experience of this low world. Cypher's cure could not stand the strain of the increased advertisement. Shuttleworth found a dismal pleasure in the fulfilment of his prophecy. A reduction in price had not materially affected the sales. The Gibraltar Jones people had lowered the price of the cuticle remedy and still undersold the cure. During the year the Bermondsey Works had been heavily mortgaged. The money had all been wasted on a public that had eyes and saw not, that had ears and heard not. The simple gospel of the friends of humanity, try Cypher's cure. In the midst of the gloom, Shuttleworth took the opportunity of deprecating the unnecessary expense of production, never having so greatly dared before. Only the best and purest materials had been possible for the divine ointment. By using second qualities, a great saving could be effected without impairing the efficacy of the cure. Thus Shuttleworth. Cypher blazed into holy anger, as if he had been counselled to commit sacrilege. Radical reforms were imperative if the cure was to be saved. He spent his nights over vast schemes, only to find the fatal flaw in the cold light of the morning. This angered him. It seemed that the sureness of his vision had gone. Something strange, uncanny, had happened within him. He knew not what. It had nothing to do with his intellectual force, his personal energy. It had nothing to do with his determination to win through and restore the cure to its former position in the market. It was something subtle, spiritual. The memory of the blistered heel lived with him. The slight doubt cast by Septimus on Zora's faith remained disturbingly at the back of his mind. Yet he clung passionately to his belief. If it were not heaven-sent, then was he of men most miserable. Never had he welcomed the sight of Nunsmere more than the next Saturday afternoon, when the trap turned off the high road and the common came into view. The pearls and faint blues of the sky, the tender mist softening the russet of the autumn trees, the grey tower of the little church, the red roofs of the cottages dreaming in their old-world gardens, the quiet green of the common with the children far off at play, and the lame donkey watching them in philosophic content. All came like the gift of a very calm and restful God to the tired man's eyes. He thought to himself, "It only lacks one figure walking across the common to meet me." Then the thought again, "If she were there, would I see anything else?" At Penton Court the maid met him at the door. "Mr. Dix is waiting to see you, sir." "Mr. Dix? Where is he?" "In the drawing-room. He's been waiting a couple of hours." He threw off his hat and coat, delighted, and rushed in to welcome the unexpected guest. He found Septimus sitting in the twilight by the French window that opened on the lawn, and making elaborate calculations in a notebook. "My dear Dix!" He shook him warmly by the hand and clapped him on the shoulder. "This is more than a pleasure. What have you been doing with yourself?" Septimus said, holding up the notebook, "I was just trying to work out the problem whether a boy's expenses from the time he begins feeding bottles to the time he leaves the university increases by arithmetical or geometrical progression." Cypher laughed. "It depends, doesn't it, on his taste for luxuries?" "This one is going to be extravagant, I'm afraid," said Septimus. "He cuts his teeth on a 15th-century Italian ivory carving of St. John the Baptist. I went into a shop to buy a purse, and they gave it to me instead, and turns up his nose at coral and bells. There isn't much of it to turn up. I've never seen a child with so little nose. I invented a machine for elongating it, but his mother won't let me use it." Cypher expressed his sympathy with Mrs. Dix, and inquired after her health. Septimus reported favourably. She had passed a few weeks at Hottetot-sur-Mer, which had done her good. She was now in Paris under the mothering care of Madame Boulevard, where she would stay until she cared to take up her residence in her flat in Chelsea, which was now free from tenants. "And you?" asked Cypher. "I've just left the Hotel Godet and come back to Nunsmere. Perhaps I'll give up the house and take Wiggleswick to London when Emmy returns. She promised to look out a flat for me. I believe women are rather good at finding flats." Cypher handed him a box of cigars. He lit one and held it awkwardly with the tips of his long and nervous fingers. He passed the fingers of his other hand, with a familiar gesture, up his hair. "I thought I'd come and see you," he said hesitatingly, "before going to the Nook. There are explanations to be made. My wife and I are good friends, but we can't live together. It's all my fault. I make the house intolerable. I have an ungovernable temper, you know, and I'm harsh and unloving and disagreeable, and it's bad for the child. We quarrel dreadfully. Well, at least she doesn't." "What about?" Cypher asked gravely. "All sorts of things. You see, if I want breakfast an hour before dinner-time, it upsets the household. Then there was the nose machine and other inventions for the baby, which perhaps might kill it. You can explain all this, and tell them that the marriage has been a dreadful mistake on poor Emmy's side, and that we've decided to live apart. You will do this for me, won't you?" "I can't say I'll do it with pleasure," said Cypher, "for I'm more than sorry to hear your news. I suspected as much when I met you in Paris. But I'll see Mrs. Oldreeve as soon as possible and explain." "Thank you," said Septimus. "You don't know what a service you will be rendering me." He uttered a sigh of relief and relit his cigar, which had gone out during his appeal. Then there was a silence. Septimus looked dreamily out at the row of trees that marked the famous lawn reaching down to the railway line. The mist had thickened with the fall of the day and hung heavy on the branches, and the sky was grey. Cypher watched him, greatly moved, tempted to cry out that he knew all, that he was not taken in by the simple legend of his ungovernable temper and unlovely disposition. His heart went out to him, as to a man who dwelt alone on lofty heights inaccessible to common humanity. He was filled with pity and reverence for him. Perhaps he exaggerated, but Cypher was an idealist. Had he not set Cypher's cure as the sun in his heaven, and Zora as one of the fixed stars? It grew dark. Cypher rang for the lamp and tea. "Oh, would you like breakfast?" he asked laughingly. "I've just had supper," said Septimus. "Wiggleswick found some cheese in a cupboard. I buried it in the front garden." A vague smile passed on his face, like a pale gleam of light over water on a cloudy day. "Wiggleswick is deaf. He couldn't hear it." "He's a lazy scoundrel," said Cypher. "I wonder you don't sack him." Septimus licked a hanging strip of cigar end into position — he could never smoke a cigar properly — and lit it for the third time. "Wiggleswick is good for me," said he. "He keeps me human. I am apt to become a machine, I live so much among them. I've been working hard on a new gun, or rather an old gun. It's field artillery, quick firing. I got onto the idea again from a sighting apparatus I invented. I have the specification in my pocket. The model is at home. I brought it from Paris." He fetched a parcel of manuscript from his pocket and unrolled it into flatness. "I should like to show it to you. Do you mind?" "It would interest me enormously," said Cypher. "I invent all sorts of things. I can't help it. But I always come back to guns. I don't know why. I hope you've done nothing further with the gun of large calibre. I've been thinking about them seriously, and I find they're all moonshine." He smiled with wan cheerfulness at the waste of the labour of years. Cypher, on whose conscience the guns had lain their 200-ton weight, felt greatly relieved. Their colossal scale had originally caught his imagination, which loved big conceptions. Their working had seemed plausible to his inexpert eye. He had gone with confidence to his friend, the expert on naval gunnery, who had reported on them in breezy, sea-going terms of disrespect. Since then he had shrunk from destroying his poor friend's illusions. "Yes, they're all unmanageable. I see what's wrong with them, but I've lost my interest in naval affairs." He paused and added dreamily, "I was horribly seasick crossing the Channel this time." "Let us have a look at the field gun," said Cypher encouragingly. Remembering the naval man's language, he had little hope that Septimus would be more successful by land than by sea, but his love and pity for the inventor compelled interest. Septimus's face brightened. "This," said he, "is quite a different thing. You see, I know more about it." "That's where the bombardier comes in," laughed Cypher. "I shouldn't wonder," replied Septimus. He spread the diagram on a table and expounded the gun. Absorbed in his explanation, he lost the drowsy incertitude of his speech and the dreaminess of his eyes. He spoke with rapidity, sureness, and a note of enthusiasm rang oddly in his voice. On the margins he sketched illustrations of the Gatling, the Maxim, and the Hotchkiss and other guns, and demonstrated the superior delicate deadliness of his own. It could fire more rounds per minute than any other piece of artillery known to man. It could feed itself automatically from a magazine. The new sighting apparatus made it as accurate as a match rifle. Its power of massacre was unparalleled in the history of wholesale slaughter. A child might work it. Septimus's explanation was too lucid for a man of Cypher's intelligence not to grasp the essentials of his invention. To all his questions Septimus returned satisfactory answers. He could find no flaw in the gun, yet in his heart he felt that the expert would put his finger on the weak spot and consign the machine to the limbo of phantasmagoric artillery. "If it is all you say, there's a fortune in it," said he. "There's no shadow of doubt about it," replied Septimus. "I'll send Wiggleswick over with the model tomorrow, and you can see for yourself." "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know," said Septimus in his usual manner. "I never know what to do with things when I invent them. I once knew a man in the patent office who patented things for me, but he's married now and gone to live in Balham." "But he's still at the patent office?" "Perhaps he is," said Septimus. "It never occurred to me. But it has never done me any good to have things patented. One has to get them taken up. Some of them are drunk and disorderly enough for them to be taken up at once," he added with his pale smile. He continued, "I thought perhaps you would replace the big caliber guns in our contract by this one." Cypher agreed with pleasure to the proposal. He knew a high military official in the Ordnance Department of the War Office who would see that the thing was properly considered. "If he's in town, I'll go and see him at once." "There's no hurry," said Septimus. "I shouldn't like you to put yourself out. I know you're a very busy man. Go in any time you happen to be passing. You are there pretty often now, I suppose?"
"Why?"
"My friend Egisipi Cruchot gave you an idea in Paris about soldiers' feet. How is it developing?" Cypher made a wry face. "I found, my dear Dix, it was like your guns of large caliber." He rose and walked impatiently about the room. "Don't let us talk about the cure, there's a dear fellow. I came down here to forget it." "Forget it?" Septimus stared at him in amazement. "Yes, to clear my mind and brain of it, to get a couple of nights' sleep after the rest of the week's nightmare. The concern is going to hell as fast as it can, and—" He stopped in front of Septimus and brought down his hands in a passionate gesture. "I can't believe it. I can't believe it. What I'm going through, God only knows." "I at least had no notion," said Septimus, "and I've been worrying you with my silly twaddle about babies and guns." "It's a godsend for me to hear of anything save ruin and the breaking up of all that was dear to me in life. It's not like failure in an ordinary business. It has been infinitely more than a business to me. It has been a religion. It is still. That's why my soul refuses to grasp facts and figures." He went on, feeling a relief in pouring out his heart to one who could understand. To no one had he thus spoken. With an expansive nature he had the strong man's pride. To the world in general he turned the conquering face of Clem Cypher, the friend of humanity, of Cypher's cure. To Septimus alone had he shown the man in his desperate revolt against defeat. The lines around his mouth deepened into lines of pain, and pain lay behind his clear eyes and in the knitting of his brows. "I believe the Almighty had put an instrument for the relief of human suffering into my hands. I dreamed great dreams. I saw all the nations of the earth blessing me. I know I was a damned fool. So are you, so is every visionary. So are the apostles, the missionaries, the explorers, all who dream great dreams, all damned fools. But a glorious company all the same. I'm not ashamed to belong to it. But there comes a time when the apostle finds himself preaching to the empty winds, and the explorer discovers his El Dorado to be a barren island, and he either goes mad or breaks his heart, and which of the two I'm going to do I don't know. Perhaps both." "Zora Middlemist will be back soon," said Septimus. "She's coming by the White Star Line, and she ought to be in Marseille by the end of next week." "She writes to me that she may winter in Egypt. That is why she chose the White Star Line," said Cypher. "Have you told her what you've told me?" "No," said Cypher, "and I never shall while there's a hope left. She knows it's a fight, but I tell her, as I've told my damned fool of a soul, that I shall conquer. Would you like to go to her and say, I'm done. I'm beaten. Besides, I'm not. He turned and poked the fire, smashing a great lump of coal with a stroke of his muscular arm, as if it had been the skull of the Jebusa Jones dragon. Septimus twirled his small moustache, and his hand inevitably went to his hair. He had the scared look he always wore at moments when he was coming to a decision. "But you would like to see Zora, wouldn't you?" he asked. Cypher wheeled round, and the expression on his face was that of a prisoner in the Bastille who had been asked whether he would like a summer banquet beneath the trees of Fontainebleau. "You know that very well," said he. He laid down the poker and crossed the room to a chair. "I've often thought of what you said in Paris about her going away. You were quite right. You have a genius for saying and doing the simple right thing. We almost began our friendship by your saying it. Do you remember? It was in Monte Carlo. You remember that you didn't like my looking on Mrs. Middlemist as an advertisement. Oh, you needn't look uncomfortable, my dear fellow. I loved you for it. In Paris you practically told me that I oughtn't to regard her as a kind of fetish for the cure and claim her bodily presence. You also put before me the fact that there was no more reason for her to believe in the cure than yourself or Egisipe Groucho. If you could tell me anything more, said he earnestly, I should value it. What he expected to learn from Septimus he did not know. But once, having exalted him to inaccessible heights, the indomitable idealist was convinced that from his lips would fall words of gentle Olympian wisdom. Septimus, blushing at his temerity in having pointed out the way to the man whom he regarded as the incarnation of force and energy, curled himself up awkwardly in his chair, clasping his ankles between his locked fingers. At last the oracle spoke. "If I were you," he said, "before going mad or breaking my heart, I should wait until I saw Zora." "Very well. It'll be a long time. Perhaps so much the better. I shall remain sane and heart-whole all the longer." After dinner Cypher went round to the Nook, and executed his difficult mission as best he could. To carry out Septimus's wishes, which involved the vilification of the innocent and the beatification of the guilty, went against his conscience. He omitted, therefore, reference to the demonic rages which returned the house into an inferno, and to the quarrels over the machine for elongating the baby's nose. Their tempers were incompatible, they found a common life impossible, so, according to the wise modern view of things, they decided to live apart while maintaining cordial relations. Mrs. Oldreeve was greatly distressed. Tears rolled down her cheeks onto her knitting. The old order was changing too rapidly for her, and the new to which it was giving place seemed anarchy to her bewildered eyes. She held up tremulous hands in protest. Husband and wife living apart so cheerfully for such trivial reasons? Even if one had suffered great wrongs at the hands of the other, it was their duty to remain side by side. Those whom God had joined together. "He didn't," snapped Cousin Jane. "They were joined together by a scrubby man in a registry office." This is the wild and unjust way in which women talk. For aught Cousin Jane knew, the Chelsea registrar might have been an Antinous for beauty. Mrs. Oldreeve shook her head sadly. She had known how it would be. If only they had been married in church by their good vicar, this calamity could not have befallen them. All the churches and all the vicars and all the archbishops couldn't have made that man anything else than a doddering idiot. How Emily could have borne with him for a day passes my understanding. She's done well to get rid of him. She's made a mess of it, of course. People who marry in that way generally do. It serves her right. So spoke Cousin Jane, whom Cypher found, in a sense, an unexpected ally. She made his task easier. Mrs. Oldreeve remained unconvinced. "And the baby just a month or so old. Poor little thing. What's to become of it?" "Emmy will have to come here," said Cousin Jane firmly, "and I'll bring it up. Emmy isn't fit to educate a rabbit. You'd better write and order her to come home at once." "I'll write tomorrow," sighed Mrs. Oldreeve. Cypher reflected on the impossibilities of the proposition, and on the reasons Emmy still had for remaining in exile in Paris. He pitied the child that was to be brought up by Cousin Jane. It had extravagant tastes. He smiled. "My friend Dix is already thinking of sending him to the university, so you see they have plans for his education." Cousin Jane sniffed. She would make plans for them. As for the university, if it could turn out a doddering idiot like Septimus, it was criminal to send any young man to such a seat of unlearning. She would not allow him to have a voice in the matter. Amy was to be summoned to Nunsmere. Cypher was about to deprecate the idea, when he reflected again, and thought of Hotspur and the spirits from the vasty deep. Cousin Jane could call, and so could Mrs. Aldrieve. But would Amy come? As the answer to the question was in the negative, he left Cousin Jane to her comfortable resolutions. "You will no doubt discuss the matter with Dix," he said. Cousin Jane threw up her hands. "Oh, for goodness' sake, don't let him come here. I couldn't bear the sight of him." Cypher looked inquiringly at Mrs. Aldrieve. "It has been a great shock to me," said the gentle lady. "It will take time to get over it. Perhaps he'd better wait a little." Cypher walked home in a wrathful mood. Ostracism was to be added to Septimus's crown of martyrdom. Perhaps, on the other hand, the closing of the Nook doors was advantageous. He had dreaded the result of Cousin Jane's cross-examination, as lying was not one of his friend's conspicuous accomplishments. Soothed by this reflection, he smoked a pipe and took down Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress from his shelves. While he was deriving spiritual entertainment from the great battle between Christian and Apollyon, and consolation from the latter's discomfiture, Septimus was walking down the road to the post office, a letter in his hand. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. Middlemist, White Star Company's SS Cedric, Marseille. It contained a blank sheet of headed notepaper and the tail of a little china dog. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Septimus by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 18. As soon as a woman knows what she wants, she generally gets it. Some philosophers assert that her methods are circuitous. Others, on the other hand, maintain that she rides in a bee-line towards the desired object, galloping ruthlessly over conventions, susceptibilities, hearts, and such like obstacles. All, however, agree that she is unscrupulous, that the wish of the woman is the politely insincere wish of the deity, and that she pursues her course with a serene sureness unknown to man. It is when a woman does not know what she wants that she baffles the philosopher, just as the ant in her aimless discursiveness baffles the entomologist. Of course, if the philosopher has guessed her unformulated desire, then things are easy for him, and he can discourse with certitude on feminine vagaries, as Ratton did on the journeyings of Zora Middlemist. He has the word of the enigma. But to the woman herself, her state of mind is an exasperating puzzle, and to her friends, philosophic or otherwise, her consequent actions are disconcerting. Zora went to California, where she was hospitably entertained, and shown the sights of several vast neighborhoods. She peeped into the Chinese quarter at San Francisco, and visited the Yosemite Valley. Attentive young men strewed her path with flowers and candy. Young women vowed her eternal devotion. She came into touch with the intimate problems of the most wonderful social organism the world has ever seen, and was confronted with stupendous works of nature and illimitable solitudes wherein the soul stands appalled. She also ate a great quantity of peaches. When her visit to the Calendars had come to an end, she armed herself with introductions and started off by herself to see America. She travelled across the continent, beheld the majesty of Niagara and the bewildering life of New York. She went to Washington and Boston. In fact, she learnt many things about a great country which were very good for her to know, receiving impressions with the alertness of a sympathetic intellect, and pigeon-holing them with feminine conscientiousness for future reference. It was all very pleasant, healthful, and instructive, but it no more helped her in her quest than gazing at the jewellers' windows in the Rue de la Paix. Snow-capped sierras and crowded tramcars were equally unsuggestive of a mission in life. In the rare moments which activity allowed her for depression, she began to wonder whether she was not chasing the phantom of a wild goose. A damsel, to whom in a moment of expansion she revealed the object of her journeying, exclaimed, What other mission in life has a woman than to spend money and look beautiful?" Zora laughed incredulously. "You've accomplished half already, for you do look beautiful," said the damsel. "The other half is easy." "But if you haven't much money to spend—" "Spend someone else's. Lord, if I had your beauty, I'd just walk down Wall Street and pick up a millionaire between my finger and thumb and carry him off right away." When Zora suggested that life perhaps might have some deeper significance, the maiden answered, "Life is like the schoolchild's idea of a parable, a heavenly story, if you've lots of money, with no earthly meaning." "Don't you ever go down beneath the surface of things?" asked Zora. "If you dig down far enough into the earth," replied the damsel, "you come to water. If you bore down deep enough into life, you come to tears. My dear, I'm going to dance on the surface and have a good time as long as I can. And I guess you're doing the same." "I suppose I am," said Zora, and she felt ashamed of herself. At Washington, fate gave her an opportunity of attaining the other half of the damsel's idea. An elderly senator of enormous wealth proposed marriage, and offered her half a dozen motor cars, a few palaces, and most of the 2 hemispheres. She declined. "If I were young, would you marry me?" Zora's beautiful shoulders gave the tiniest shrug of uncertainty. Perhaps her young friend was right, and the command of the earth was worth the slight penalty of a husband. She was tired and disheartened, and finding herself no nearer to the heart of things than when she had left Nunsmere. Her attitude toward the once unspeakable sex had imperceptibly changed. She no longer blazed with indignation when a man made love to her. She even found it more agreeable than looking at cataracts or lunching with ambassadors. Sometimes she wondered why. The senator she treated very tenderly. "I don't know. How can I tell?" she said a moment or two after the shrug. "My heart is young," said he. Zora met his eyes for the millionth part of a second and turned her head away, deeply sorry for him. The woman's instinctive look dealt instantaneous death to his hopes. It was one more enactment of the tragedy of the bald head and the grey beard. He spoke with pathetic bitterness. Like Dom Ruy Gomez da Silva in Hernani, he gave her to understand that now, when a young fellow passed him in the street, he would give up all his motor cars and all his colossal canned salmon business for the young fellow's raven hair and bright eyes. "Then you would love me. I could make you." "What is love, after all?" asked Zora. The elderly senator looked wistfully through the years over an infinite welter of salmon tins, seeing nothing else. "It's the meaning of life," said he. "I've discovered it too late." He went away sorrowful, and Zora saw the vanity of great possessions. On the homeward steamer she had as a travelling companion a young Englishman whom she had met at Los Angeles, one Anthony Dasent, an engineer of some distinction. He was bronzed and healthy and lithe-limbed. She liked him because he had brains and looked her squarely in the face. On the first evening of the voyage, a slight lurch of the vessel caused her to slip, and she would have fallen had he not caught her by the arms. For the first time she realized how strong a man could be. It was a new sensation, not unpleasurable, and in thanking him she blushed. He remained with her on deck and talked of their California friends and the United States. The next day he established himself by her side, and discoursed on the sea and the sky, human aspirations, the discomforts of his cabin, and a belief in eternal punishment. The day after that he told her of his ambitions, and showed her photographs of his mother and sisters. After that they exchanged views on the discipline of loneliness. His profession, he observed, took him to the waste places of the earth, where there was never a woman to cheer him, and when he came back to England he returned to a hearth equally unconsoled. Zora began to pity his forlorn condition. To build strong bridges and lay down railroads was a glorious thing for a man to do. To do it without sweetheart or wife was nothing less than heroic. In the course of time he told her that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever met. He expressed his admiration of the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and the gleams of gold in her hair when it was caught by the sun. He also wished that his sisters could have their skirts cut like hers, and could learn the art of tying a veil over a hat. Then he took to scowling on inoffensive young men who fetched her wraps and lent her their binoculars. He declared one of them to be an unmitigated ass, to throw whom overboard would be to insult the Atlantic. And then Zora recognized that he was stolidly in love with her, after the manner of his stolid kind. She felt frightened, and accused herself of coquetry. Her sympathy with his barren existence had perhaps overstepped the boundaries of polite interest. She had raised false hopes in a young and ingenuous bosom. She worked herself up to a virtuous pitch of self-reprobation and flagellated herself soundly, taking the precaution, however, of wadding the knots of the scourge with cotton wool. After all, was it her fault that a wholesome young Briton should fall in love with her? She remembered Rattenden's uncomfortable words on the eve of her first pilgrimage. Beautiful women like yourself, radiating feminine magnetism, worry a man exceedingly. You don't let him go about in peace, so why should he let you? So Zora came face to face with the eternal battle of the sexes. She stamped her foot in the privacy of her cabin, and declared the principle to be horrid and primeval, and everything that was most revolting to a woman who had earnestly set forth to discover the highest things of life. For the remainder of the voyage she avoided Antidasant's company as much as possible, and lest he should add jealousy to the gloom in which he inverted himself, sought unexciting joys in the society of a one-eyed geologist who discoursed playfully on the foraminifera of the Pacific slope. One day Dasant came on her alone, and burst out wrathfully, "Why are you treating me like this?" "Like what? You are making a fool of me. I'm not going to stand it." Then she realized that when the average man does not get what he wants exactly when he wants it, he loses his temper. She soothed him according to the better instincts of her sex, but resolved to play no more with elementary young Britons. One-eyed geologists were safer companions. The former pitched their hearts into her lap. The latter, like Pawkins, the geologist of the Pacific slope, gave her boxes of fossils. She preferred the fossils. You could do what you liked with them, throw them overboard when the donor was not looking, or leave them behind in a railway carriage, or take them home and present them to the vicar who collected butterflies, beetles, ammonites, and tobacco stoppers. But an odd assortment of hearts to a woman who does not want them is really a confounded nuisance. Zora was much relieved when Dasant, after eating an enormous breakfast, bade her a tragic farewell at Gibraltar. It was a cloudless afternoon when she steamed into Marseille. The barren rock islands on the east rose blue-grey from a blue sea. To the west lay the Isles of Frioul and the isle of the Château d'If, with its prison lying grim and long on the crest. In front, the busy port, the white noble city crowned by the church of Notre-Dame de la Garde, standing sentinel against the clear sky. Zora stood on the crowded deck watching the scene, touched as she always was by natural beauty, but sad at heart. Marseille, within 24 hours of London, meant home. Although she intended to continue her wanderings to Naples and Alexandria, she felt that she had come to the end of her journey. It had been as profitless as the last. Pawkins, by her side, pointed out the geological feature of the rocks. She listened vaguely, and wondered whether she was to bring him home tied to her chariot, as she had brought Septimus Dix and Clem Cypher. The thought of Cypher drew her heart to Marseille. "I wish I were landing here like you and going straight home," she said, interrupting the flow of scientific information. "I've already been to Naples, and I shall find nothing I want at Alexandria." "Geologically, it's not very interesting," said Pawkins. "I'm afraid prehistoric antiquity doesn't make my pulses beat faster." "That's the advantage of it. One might just as well be a fossil oneself." "Much better," said Pawkins, who had read Schopenhauer. "You are not exhilarating to a depressed woman," said Zora with a laugh. "I am sorry," he replied stiffly. "I was trying to entertain you." He regarded her severely out of his one eye, and edged away, as if he repented having wasted his time over so futile an organism as a woman. But her feminine magnetism drew him back. "I'm rather glad you are going on to Alexandria," he remarked in a tone of displeasure, and before she could reply he marched off to look after his luggage. Zora's eyes followed him until he disappeared. Then she shrugged her shoulders. Apparently one-eyed geologists were as unsafe as elementary young Britons and opulent senators. She felt unfairly treated by Providence. It was maddening to realize herself as of no use in the universe except to attract the attention of the opposite sex. She clenched her hands in impotent anger. There was no mission on earth which she could fulfill. She thought enviously of Cousin Jane. The steamer entered the harbour, the passengers from Marseille landed, and the mail was brought aboard. There was only one letter for Mrs. Middlemist. It bore the Nunsmere postmark. She opened it and found the tail of the little China dog. She looked at it for a moment wonderingly as it lay absurdly curled in the palm of her hand, and then she burst into tears. The thing was so grotesquely trivial. It meant so much. It was a sign and a token, falling as it were from the sky into the midst of her despairing mood, rebuking her, summoning her, declaring an unknown mission which she was bound to execute. It lay in her hand like a bit of destiny, inexorable, unquestionable, silently compelling her forthwith to the human soul that stood in great need of her. Fate had granted the wish she had expressed to the one-eyed geologist. She landed at Marseille and sped homeward by the night train, her heart torn with anxiety for Septimus. All night long the rhythmic clatter of the train shaped itself into the burden of her words to him. "If ever you want me badly, send me the tale, and I'll come to you from any distance." She had spoken then half-jestingly, all tenderly. That evening she had loved him in a sort of way, and now that he had sent for her, the love returned. The vivid experiences of the past months which had blinded her to the quieter light of home faded away into darkness. Septimus in urgent need, Emmy and Clem Cypher filled her thoughts. She felt thankful that Cypher, strong and self-reliant, was there to be her ally, should her course with Septimus be difficult. Between them they could surely rescue the ineffectual being from whatever dangers assailed him. But what could they be? The question racked her. Did it concern Emmy? A child, she knew, had just been born. A chill fear crept on her lest some tragedy had occurred through Septimus's folly. From him any outrageous senselessness might be expected, and Emmy herself was scarcely less irresponsible than her babe. She reproached herself for having suggested his marriage with Emmy. Perhaps in his vacant way he had acted entirely on her prompting. The marriage was wrong. Two helpless children should never have taken on themselves the graver duties of life towards each other and future generations. If it were a case in which a man's aid was necessary, there stood Cypher, a great pillar of comfort. Unconsciously she compared him with the man with whom she had come in contact during her travels, and she had met many of great charm and strength and knowledge. For some strange reason which she could not analyze, he towered above them all, though in each separate quality of character others whom she could name surpassed him far. She knew his faults, in her lofty way, smiled at them. Her character as goddess or guardian angel or fairy patroness of the cure she had assumed with the graciousness of a grown-up lady playing charades at a children's party. His occasional lapses from the traditions of her class jarred on her fine susceptibilities. Yet there, in spite of all, he stood rooted in her life, a fact, a puzzle, a pride and a consolation. The other men paled into unimportant ghosts before him, and strayed shadowy through the limbo of her mind. Till now she had not realized it. Septimus, however, had always dwelt in her heart like a stray dog whom she had rescued from vagrancy. He did not count as a man. Cypher did. Thus, during the long, tedious hours of the journey home, the two were curiously mingled in her anxious conjectures, and she had no doubt that Cypher and herself, the strong and masterful, would come to the deliverance of the weak. Septimus, who had received a telegram from Marseille, waited for her train at Victoria. In order to ensure being in time, he had arrived a couple of hours too soon, and patiently wandered about the station. Now and then he stopped before the engines of trains at rest, fascinated, as he always was, by perfect mechanism. A driver, dismounting from the cab, and seeing him lost in admiration of the engine, passed him a civil word, to which Septimus, always courteous, replied. They talked further. "I see you're an engineer, sir," said the driver, who found himself in conversation with an appreciative expert. "My father was," said Septimus, "but I could never get up in time for my examinations. Examinations seem so silly. Why should you tell a set of men what they know already?" The grimy driver expressed the opinion that examinations were necessary. He who spoke had passed them. "I suppose you can get up at any time," Septimus remarked enviously. "Somebody ought to invent a machine for those who can't." "You only want an alarm clock," said the driver. Septimus shook his head. "They're no good. I tried one once, but it made such a dreadful noise that I threw a boot at it." "Did that stop it?" "No," murmured Septimus. "The boot hit another clock on the mantelpiece, a Louis XV clock, and spoiled it. I did get up, but I found the method too expensive, so I never tried it again." The engine of an outgoing train blew off steam, and the resounding din deafened the station. Septimus held his hands to his ears. The driver grinned. "I can't stand that noise," Septimus explained when it was over. "Once I tried to work out an invention for modifying it. It was a kind of combination between a gramophone and an orchestrion. You stuck it inside somewhere, and instead of the awful screech, a piece of music would come out of the funnel. In fact, it might have gone on playing all the time the train was in motion. It would have been so cheery for the drivers, wouldn't it?" The unimaginative mechanic, whose wits were scattered by this fantastic proposition, used his bit of cotton waste as a handkerchief, and remarked with vague politeness that it was a pity the gentleman was not an engineer. But Septimus deprecated the compliment. He looked wistfully up at the girders of the glass roof, and spoke in his gentle, tired voice. "You see," he concluded, "if I had been in practice as an engineer, I should never have designed machinery in the orthodox way. I should have always put in little things of my own, and then God knows what would have happened." He brought his eyes to earth with a wan smile, but his companion had vanished. A crowd had filled the suburban platform at the end of which he stood, and in a few moments the train clattered off. Then, remembering that he was hungry, he went to the refreshment room, where, at the suggestion of the barmaid, he regaled himself on 2 hard-boiled eggs and a glass of sherry. The meal over, he loitered palely about the busy station, jostled by frantic gentlemen in silk hats rushing to catch suburban trains, and watched grimly by a policeman who suspected a pocket-picking soul beneath his guileless exterior. At last, by a special grace of heaven, he found himself on the platform where the custom-house barrier and the long line of waiting porters heralded the approach of the Continental train. Now that only a few moments separated him from Zora, his heart grew cold with suspense. He had not seen her since the night of Emmy's fainting fit. Her letters, though kind, had made clear to him her royal displeasure at his unceremonious marriage. For the first time he would look into her gold-flecked eyes out of a disingenuous soul. Would she surprise his guilty secret? It was the only thing he feared in a bewildering world. The train came in, and as her carriage flashed by, Zora saw him on the platform with his hat off, passing his fingers nervously through his struwelpeter hair. The touch of the familiar welcoming her brought moisture to her eyes. As soon as the train stopped, she alighted, and leaving Turner, who had accompanied her on the pilgrimage, and from Dover had breathed fervent thanks to heaven that at last she was back in the land of her fathers, to look after her luggage, she walked down the platform to meet him. He was just asking a porter at frantic grapple with the hand baggage of a large family whether he had seen a tall and extraordinarily beautiful lady in the train, when she came up to him with outstretched hands and beaming eyes. He took the hands and looked long at her, unable to speak. Never had she appeared to him more beautiful, more gracious. The royal waves of her hair beneath a fur travelling toque invested her with queenliness. The full youth of her figure, not hidden by a fur jacket, brought to him the generous woman. A bunch of violets at her bosom suggested the fragrant essence of her. "Oh, it's good to see you, Septimus. It's good," she cried. "The sight of you makes me feel as if nothing mattered in the world except the people one cares for. How are you?" "I'm very well indeed," said Septimus, "full of inventions." She laughed, and guided him up the platform through the cross-traffic of porters carrying luggage from train to cabs. "Is mother all right?" she asked anxiously. "Oh, yes," said Septimus. And Emmy and the baby? Remarkably well. Emmy's had him christened. I wanted him to be called after you. Zoroaster was the only man's name I could think of, but she didn't like it, and so she called it Octavius after me. Also Oldreeve after the family, and William. Why William? After Pitt, said Septimus in the tone of a man who gives the obvious answer. She halted for a moment, perplexed. Pitt? Yes, the great statesman. He's going to be a member of Parliament, you know. Oh, said Zora, moving slowly on. His mother says it's after the lame donkey on the common. We used to call it William. He hasn't changed a bit since you left. So the baby's full name is, said Zora, ignoring the donkey, William Octavius Oldreeve Dix. It's so helpful to have a child to have a good name. I long to see him, said Zora. He's in Paris just now. Paris? She echoed. Oh, he's not by himself, you know, Septimus hastened to reassure her, lest she might think that the babe was alone among the temptations and dissipations of the gay city. His mother's there too. She shook him by the coat sleeve. What an exasperating thing you are! Why didn't you tell me? I could have broken my journey, or at least asked them to meet me at the Gare du Nord. But why aren't they in England? I didn't bring them with me. She laughed again at his tone, suspecting nothing. You speak as if you'd accidentally left them behind, like umbrellas. Did you? Turner came up, attended by a porter with the hand baggage. Are you going on to Nunsmere tonight, ma'am? Why should you? Asked Septimus. I had intended to do so, but if Mother is quite well, and Emmy and the baby are in Paris, and you yourself are here, I don't quite see the necessity. It would be much nicer if you remained in London, said he. Very well, said Zora, we shall. We can put up at the Grosvenor Hotel here for the night. Where are you staying? Septimus murmured the name of his sedate club, where his dissolute morning appearance was still remembered against him. Go and change and come back and dine with me at an hour's time. He obeyed the command with his usual meekness, and Zora followed the porter through the subway to the hotel. We haven't dined together like this, she said, unfolding her napkin an hour afterwards, since Monte Carlo. Then it was hopelessly unconventional. Now we can dine in the strictest propriety. Do you understand that you're my brother-in-law? She laughed, radiant, curiously happy at being with him. She realized with a little shock of discovery the restfulness of the essential quality of his companionship. He was a quiet haven after stormy seas. He represented something intimate and tender in her life. They spoke for a while of common things, her train journey, the crossing, the wonders she had seen. He murmured incoherent sketches of his life in Paris, the new gun, and Egisipe Cruchot. But of the reason for his summons he said nothing. At last she leaned across the table and said gently, Why am I here, Septimus? You haven't told me. Haven't I? No, you see, the little dog's tail brought me post-haste to you, but it gave me no inkling why you wanted me so badly. He looked at her in his scared manner. Oh, I don't want you at all, at least I do most tremendously, but not for myself. For whom, then? Clem Cypher, said Septimus. She paled slightly, and looked down at her plate and crumbled bread. For a long time she did not speak. The announcement did not surprise her. In an inexplicable way it seemed natural. Septimus and Cypher had shared her thoughts so oddly during her journey. An unaccountable shyness had checked her impulse to inquire after his welfare. Indeed, now that the name was spoken, she could scarcely believe that she had not expected to hear it. "What is the matter?" she asked at length. "The cure has failed." "Failed?" She looked up at him half incredulously. The very last letters she had received from Cypher had been full of the lust of battle. Septimus nodded gloomily. It was only a silly patent ointment like 100 others, but it was Cypher's religion. Now his gods have gone, and he's lost. It's not good for a man to have no gods. I didn't have any once. The devils came in. They drove me to try hashish. But it must have been very bad hashish, for it made me sick, and so I was saved. What made you send for me so urgently? The dog's tail. You knew I had to come. Cypher wanted you to give him some new gods. He could have sent for me himself. Why did he ask you? He didn't, cried Septimus. "He doesn't know anything about it. He hasn't the faintest idea that you're in London tonight. Was I wrong in bringing you back?" To Zora, the incomprehensible aspect of the situation was her own attitude. She did not know whether Septimus was wrong or not. She told herself that she ought to resent the summons which had caused her such needless anxiety as to his welfare, but she could feel no resentment. Cypher had failed. The mighty had fallen. She pictured a broken-hearted man, and her own heart ached for him. "You did right, Septimus," she said very gently. "But of what use can I be to him?" Septimus said, "He's the one to tell you that." "But do you think he knows? He didn't before. He wanted me to stay as a kind of mascot for the cure, simply sit still while he drew influence out of me or something. It was absurd." It was on this occasion that Septimus made his one contribution to pessimistic philosophy. "When you analyse anything in life," said he, "don't you think that you always come down to a reductio ab absurdum?" End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Septimus by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 19. "I'm very sorry to leave you, Mr. Cypher," said Shuttleworth, "but my first duty is to my wife and family." Clem Cypher leaned back in his chair behind his great office desk and looked at his melancholy manager with the eyes of a general whose officers refuse the madness of a forlorn hope. "Quite so," he said tonelessly. "When do you want to go?" "You engaged me on a 3 months' notice, but—" "But you want to go now?" "I have a very brilliant position offered me if I can take it up in a fortnight." "Very well," said Cypher. "You won't say it's a case of rats deserting a sinking ship, will you, sir? As I say, my wife and family—" "The ship's sinking. You're quite right to leave it. Is the position offered you in the same line of business?" "Yes," said Shuttleworth, unable to meet his chief's clear, unsmiling eyes. "One of the rival firms?" Shuttleworth nodded, then broke out into mournful asseverations of loyalty. If the cure had flourished, he would have stayed with Mr. Cypher till the day of his death. He would have refused the brilliant offer, but in the circumstances— "Sauve qui peut," said Cypher. "Another month or two, and Cypher's cure becomes a thing of the past. Nothing can pull it through. I was too sanguine. I wish I had taken your advice oftener, Shuttleworth." Shuttleworth thanked him for the compliment. "One learns by experience," said he modestly. "I was born and bred in the patent medicine business. It's very risky. You start a thing, catches on for a while, then something else more attractive comes on the market. There's a war of advertising, and the bigger capital wins. The wise man gets out of it just before the rival comes. If you'd taken my advice 5 years ago and turned it into a company, you'd have been a rich man now without a care in the world. Next time you will." "There'll be no next time," said Cypher gravely. "Why not? There's always money in patent medicines. For instance, in a new cure for obesity, if properly worked. A man like you can always get the money together." "And the cure for obesity?" Shuttleworth's dismal face contracted into the grimace which passed with him for a smile. "Any old thing will do, so long as it doesn't poison people." Uncomfortable under his chief's silent scrutiny, he took off his spectacles, breathed on them, and wiped them with his handkerchief. "The public will buy anything, if you advertise it enough." "I suppose they will," said Cypher. "Even Jebusa Jones's cuticle remedy." Shuttleworth started and put on his spectacles. "Why shouldn't they buy the remedy after all?" "You ask me that?" said Cypher. All through the interview he had not shifted his position. He sat fixed like a florid ghost. The manager shuffled uneasily in his chair beside the desk and cleared his throat nervously. "I'm bound to," said he, in self-defence. "I know what you think of the cure, but that's a matter of sentiment. I've been into the thing pretty thoroughly, and I know that there's scarcely any difference in the composition of the remedy and the cure. After all, any protecting grease that keeps the microbes in the air out of the sore place does just as well, sometimes better. There's nothing in patent ointment that really cures, now is there?" "Are you going to the Jebusa Jones people?" asked Cypher. "I have my wife and family," the manager pleaded. "I couldn't refuse. They've offered me the position of their London agent. I know it must pain you," he added hurriedly, "but what could I do?" "Every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. So you will give me what they used to call my coup de grace. You'll just stab me dead as I lie dying. Well, in a fortnight's time you can go." The other rose. "Thank you very much, Mr. Cypher. You've always treated me generously, and I'm more than sorry to leave you. You bear me no ill will?" "For going from one quack remedy to another? Certainly not." It was only when the door closed behind the manager that Cypher relaxed his attitude. He put both hands up to his face, and then fell forward onto the desk, his head on his arms. The end had come. To that which mattered in the man, the lingering faith yet struggling in the throes of dissolution, Shuttleworth had indeed given the coup de grace. That he had joined the arch-enemy who in a short time would achieve his material destruction signified little. When something spiritual has been done to death, the body and mind are torpid. Even a month ago, had Shuttleworth uttered such blasphemy within these walls, Clem Cypher would have arisen in his wrath like a mad crusader, and have cloven the blasphemer from skull to chine. To-day he had sat motionless, petrified, scarcely able to feel. He knew that the man spoke truth. As well put any noxious concoction of drugs on the market and call it as specific against obesity or gravel or deafness as Cypher's cure. Between the heaven-sent panacea which was to cleanse the skin of the nations and send his name ringing down the centuries as the friend of humanity, and the shiveringly vulgar Debussy Jones's cuticle remedy, there was not an atom of important difference. One was as useful or as useless as the other. The cure was pale green, the remedy rose pink. Women liked the latter best on account of its colour. Both were quack medicaments. He raised a drawn and agonized face and looked around the familiar room where so many gigantic schemes had been laid, where so many hopes had shone radiant, and saw for the first time its blatant self-complacency, its piteous vulgarity. Facing him was the artist's original cartoon for the great poster which once had been famous all over the world, and now, for lack of money, only lingered in shreds on a forgotten hoarding in some back of beyond. He represented the friend of humanity in gesture, white beard, and general appearance resembling a benevolent minor prophet, distributing the cure to a scrofulous universe. In those glorified days he had striven to have his own lineaments depicted above the robe of the central figure, but the artist had declared them to be unpictorial, and clung to the majesty of the gentleman in the white beard. Around the latter's feet were gathered a motley crew, the fine lady in her ball dress, the shoeblack, the crowned king, the red Indian in Fenimore Cooper feathers, the half-naked negro, the wasted, ragged mother with her babe, the jockey, the Syrian leper, and a score of other types of humans, including, in the background, a hairy-faced creature, the dog-faced man of Barnum's show. They were well grouped, effective, making the direct appeal to an Anglo-Saxon populace, which in its art must have something to catch hold of, like the tannin in its overdrawn tea. It loved to stand before this poster and pick out the easily recognized characters and argue, as Cypher whose genius had suggested the inclusion of the freak had intended, what the hairy creature could represent. And as it stood and picked and argued, the great fact of Cypher's cure sank deep into their souls. He remembered the glowing pride with which he had regarded this achievement, the triumphal progress he had made in a motor car around the London hoardings the day after the poster had been pasted abroad. And now he knew it in his heart to be nothing but a tawdry, commercial lie. Framed in oak on his walls hung kindly notes relating to the cure from great personages or their secretaries. At the bottom of one ran the sprawling signature of the Grand Duke who had held him as ce bon citer at the Gare de Lyon when he started on the disastrous adventure of the blistered heel. There was the neatly docketed set of pigeonholes containing the proofs of all the advertisements he had issued. Lying before him on his desk was a copy, resplendently bound in morocco for his own gratification, of the 40-page thin paper pamphlet which was wrapped, a miracle of fine folding, about each packet of the cure. On each page the directions for use were given in a separate language. French, Fijian, Syrian, Basque were there, 40 languages, so that all the sons of men could read the good tidings and amused themselves at the same time by trying to decipher the message in alien tongues. Wherever he looked, some mockery of vain triumph met his eye. An enlargement of a snapshot photograph of the arrival of the first case of the cure on the shores of Lake Chad. Photographs of the busy factory, now worked by a dwindling staff. Proofs of full-page advertisements in which Cypher's Cure and Friend of Humanity figured in large capitals. The model of Edinburgh Castle, built by a grateful inmate of a lunatic asylum out of the red celluloid boxes of the cure. He shuddered at all these symbols and images of false gods, and bowed his head again on his arms. The abyss swallowed him. The waters closed over his head. How long he remained like this he did not know. He had forbidden his door. The busy life of the office stood still. The dull roar of Moorgate Street was faintly heard, and now and then the windows vibrated faintly. The sprawling, gilt, mid-Victorian clock on the mantelpiece had stopped. Presently an unusual rustle in the room caused him to raise his head with a start. Zora Middlemist stood before him. He sprang to his feet. "You? You?" "They wouldn't let me in. I forced my way. I said I must see you." He stared at her, open-mouthed. A shivering thrill passed through him, such as shakes a man on the verge of a great discovery. "You, Zora? You've come to me at this moment?" He looked so strange and staring, so haggard and dishevelled, that she moved quickly to him and laid both her hands on his. "My dear friend, my dearest friend, is it as bad as that?" A throb of pain underlay the commonplace words. The anguish on his face stirred the best and most womanly in her. She yearned to comfort him. But he drew a pace or two away and held up both hands as if warding her off, and stared at her still, but with a new light in his clear eyes that drank in her beauty and the sorcery of her presence. "My God!" he cried in a strained voice. "My God, what a fool I've been!" He swerved as if he had received a blow, and sank into his office chair, and turned his eyes from her to the ground, and sat stunned with joy and wonder and misery. He put out a hand blindly, and she took it, standing by his side. He knew now what he wanted. He wanted her, the woman. He wanted her voice in his ears, her kiss on his lips, her dear self in his arms. He wanted her welcome as he entered his house, her heart, her soul, her mind, her body, everything that was hers. He loved her for herself, passionately, overwhelmingly, after the simple way of men. He had raised his eyes from the deeps of hell, and in a flash she was revealed to him, incarnate heaven. He felt the touch of her gloved hand on his, and it sent a thrill through his veins which almost hurt, as the newly coursing blood hurts the man that has been revived from torpor. The mistiness that serves a strong man for tears clouded his sight. He had longed for her. She had come. From their first meeting he had recognized, with the visionary's glimpse of the spiritual, that she was the woman of women appointed unto him for help and comfort. But then the visionary had eclipsed the man. Destiny had naught to do with him, but as the instrument for the universal spreading of the cure. The cure was his life. The woman appointed unto him was appointed unto the cure equally with himself. He had violently credited her with his insane faith. He had craved her presence as a mystical influence that in some way would paralyze the Jebusa Jones dragon and give him supernatural strength to fight. He had striven with all his power to keep her radiant like a star, while his own faith lay dying. He had been a fool. All the time it was the sheer woman that had held him, the sheer man. And yet had not destiny fulfilled itself with a splendid irony in sending her to him then, in that moment of his utter anguish, of the utter annihilation of the fantastic faith whereby he had lived for years? From the first he had been right, though with a magnificent lunacy. It was she, in very truth, who had been destined to slay his dragon. It was dead now, a vulgar, slimy monster, incapable of hurt, slain by the lightning flash of love, when his eyes met hers a moment or two ago. In a confused way he realized this. He repeated mechanically, "What a fool I've been! What a fool I've been!" "Why?" asked Zora, who did not understand. "Because—" he began, and then he stopped, finding no words. "I wonder whether God sent you." "I'm afraid it was only Septimus," she said with a smile. "Septimus?" He was startled. What could Septimus have to do with her coming? He rose again, and focusing his whirling senses on conventional things, wheeled an armchair to the fire and led her to it and took his seat near her in his office chair. "Forgive me," he said, "but your coming seems supernatural. I was dazed by the wonderful sight of you. Perhaps it's not you, after all. I may be going mad and have hallucinations. Tell me that it's really you." "It's me, in flesh and blood. You can judge for yourself. And my sudden appearance is the simplest thing in the world." "But I thought you were going to winter in Egypt." "So did I, until I reached Marseille. This is how it was." She told him of the tale of the little China dog, and of her talk with Septimus the night before. "So I came to you," she concluded, "as soon as I decently could, this morning." "And I owe you to Septimus," he said. "Ah, I know. You ought to have owed me to yourself," she cried, misunderstanding him. "If I'd known things were so terrible with you, I would have come. I would really. But I was misled by your letters. They were so hopeful. Don't reproach me." "Reproach you? You who have given this crazy fellow so much? You who come to me all sweetness and graciousness, with heaven in your eyes, after having been dragged across Europe and made to sacrifice your winter of sunshine just for my sake? Oh, no, it's myself that I reproach." "For what?" she asked. "For being a fool, a crazy, blatant, self-centered fool. My God!" he exclaimed, smiting the arm of his chair, as a new view of things suddenly occurred to him. "How can you sit there? How have you suffered me these 2 years without despising me? How is it that I haven't been the mock and byword of Europe? I must have been." He rose and walked about the room in great agitation. "These things have all come crowding up together. One can't realize everything at once. Clem, cipher, friend of humanity. How they must have jeered behind my back if they thought me sincere. How they must have despised me if they thought me nothing but an advertising quack. Zora Middlemiss, for heaven's sake, tell me what you've thought of me. What have you taken me for? A madman or a charlatan?" "It is you that must tell me what has happened," said Zora earnestly. "I don't know. Septimus gave me to understand that the cure had failed. He's never clear about anything in his own mind, and he's worse when he tries to explain it to others." "Septimus," said Cipher, "is one of the children of God." "But he's a little bit incoherent on earth," she rejoined with a smile. "What has really happened?" Cipher drew a long breath and pulled himself up. "I'm on the verge of a collapse. The cure hasn't paid for the last 2 years. I hoped against hope. I flung thousands and thousands into the concern. The Jabuza Jones people and others out-advertised me, out-manoeuvred me at every turn. Now every bit of capital is gone, and I can't raise any more. I must go under." Zora began. "I have a fairly large fortune." He checked her with a gesture and looked at her clear and full. "God bless you," he said. "My heart didn't lie to me at Monte Carlo when it told me that you were a great-souled woman. Tell me, have you ever believed in the cure in the sense that I believed in it?" Zora returned his gaze. Here was no rhodomontading. The man was grappling with realities. "No," she replied simply. "Neither do I any longer," said Cipher. "There is no difference between it and any quack ointment you can buy at the first chemist's shop. That is why, even if I saw a chance of putting the concern on its legs again, I couldn't use your money. That is why I asked you just now what you have thought of me, a madman or a quack." "Doesn't the mere fact of my being here show you what I thought of you?" "Forgive me," he said. "It's wrong to ask you such questions." "It's worse than wrong. It's unnecessary." He passed his hands over his eyes and sat down. "I've gone through a lot today. I'm not quite myself, so you must forgive me if I say unnecessary things. God sent you to me this morning. Septimus was his messenger. If you hadn't appeared just now, I think I should have gone into black madness." "Tell me all about it," she said softly. "All that you care to tell. I am your nearest friend, I think." "And dearest." "And you are mine, you and Septimus. I've seen hundreds of people since I've been away, and some seem to have cared for me, but there's no one really in my life but you two. Cypher thought, and we both love you with all there is in us, and you don't know it. He also thought jealously, who are the people that have cared for you? He said, no one. A smile parted her lips as she looked him frankly in the eyes and repeated the negative. He breathed a sigh of relief, for he had remembered Ratterden's prophecy of the big man whom she was seeking, of the love for the big man, the gorgeous tropical sunshine in which all the splendour in her could develop. She had not found him. From the depths of his man's egotism, he uttered a prayer of thanksgiving. "Tell me," she said again. "Do you remember my letter from Paris in the summer?" "Yes, you had a great scheme for the armies of the world." "That was the beginning," said he. And then he told her all the grotesque story to the end, from the episode of the blistered heel. He told her things that he never told himself, things that startled him when he found them expressed in words. "In Russia," said he, "every house has its sacred pictures, even the poorest peasant's hut. They call them icons. These," waving to the walls, "were my icons. What do you think of them?" For the first time Zora became furniture and decoration of the room. The cartoon, the advertisement proofs, the model of Edinburgh Castle, produced on her the same effect as the famous board in the garden at Fenton Court. Then, however, she could argue with him on the question of taste, and lay down laws as the arbiter of the elegancies of conduct. Now he viewed the sorry images with her own eyes, and he had gone through fire to attain his clearness of vision. What could be said? Zora, the magnificent and self-reliant, found not a word, though her heart was filled with pity. She was brought face to face with the ridiculous soul-tragedy, remote from her poor little experience of life. It was no time to act the beneficent goddess. She became self-conscious, fearful to speak lest she should strike a wrong note of sympathy. She wanted to give the man so much, and she could give him so little. "I'm dying to help you," she said, rather piteously. "But how can I?" "Zora," he said huskily. She glanced up at him, and he held her eyes with his, and she saw how she could help him. "No, don't. I can't bear it." She rose and turned away. "Don't let us change things. They were so sweet before. They were so strange. You're wanting me as a sort of priestess. I used to laugh. But I loved it all the time." "That's why I said I've been a fool, Zora." The bell of the telephone connected with his manager's office rang jarringly. He seized the transmitter in anger. "How dare you ring me up when I gave orders I was to be undisturbed? I don't care who wants to see me. I'll see nobody." He threw down the transmitter. "I'm very sorry," he began. Then he stopped. The commonplace summons from the outer world brought with dismaying suddenness to his mind the practical affairs of life. He was a ruined man. The thought staggered him. How could he say to Zora Middlemist, "I'm a beggar. I want to marry you"? She came to him with both hands outstretched, her instinctive gesture when her heart went out, and used his Christian name for the first time. "Clem, let us be friends, good friends, true, dear friends, but don't spoil it all for me." When a woman, infinitely desired, pleads like that with glorious eyes, and her fragrance and her dearness are within arm's length, a man has but to catch her to him and silence her pleadings with a man's strength, and carry her off in triumph. It has been the way of man with woman since the world began, and Cypher knew it by his man's instinct. It was a temptation such as he had never dreamed was in the world. He passed through a flaming, blazing torment of battle. "Forget what I have said, Zora. We'll be friends if you so wish it." He pressed her hands and turned away. Zora felt that she had gained an empty victory. "I ought to be going," she said. "Not yet. Let us sit down and talk like friends. It's many weary months since I've seen you." She remained a little longer, and they talked quietly of many things. On bidding her good-bye, he said, half playfully, "I've often wondered why you have taken up with a fellow like me." "I suppose it's because you're a big man," said Zora. End of chapter 19.